Welcome to this session on ATI scenarios about the airspace in 2050. My name is James McMicking. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Aerospace Technology Institute. Now, before we get stuck into looking at the ATI scenarios, I want to take you into the future to the year 2045 and to paint a picture of perhaps how we would like the world to look and how we would like aerospace to look. Well, for starters, the aerospace industry has delivered some groundbreaking new aircraft. They're either running on sustainable aviation fuels or entirely new modes and types of propulsion and power system, such as hydrogen or batteries. Not only this, but we have scaled up massively the production of clean electricity through wind power, geothermal, solar, nuclear, so that we've got as much electricity as we need to service our requirements. We've also transformed how we integrate with the environment so that we've got multiple modes of clean, efficient transportation, whether it's electric cars, eVTOL vehicles, or bicycles. We are able to access all of these things in a seamless, efficient manner. We've also made great progress in terms of extracting CO2 from the atmosphere, whether it's through engineering solutions such as that depicted here, or through massive reforestation efforts. We're turning the corner on accumulated greenhouse gases. And finally, as consumers, we are far more aware of the impact of our purchasing decisions. So much so that we're able to see the impact through the supply chain of the goods and services we procure, and as a consequence, industries have been forced to entirely reconfigure their supply chains so that they're optimizing not just for economics, but for the sustainability footprint as well. Now, I think you can probably agree that this view of the year 2045 is a pretty rosy one, and it's also going to be an enormously challenging one to achieve. A lot has to come together for the world and for the various industries that need to deliver this in order to get anywhere close. And this is the challenge because, of course, the world isn't perfect. The world isn't seamless. It's noisy. In fact, right now we describe it as TUNA. So what do I mean by TUNA? Four things. Turbulent, so things happen suddenly around us and are becoming even more so. And these are sudden jolts to our environments, the environments in which our businesses operate, in which people go about their lives. It's also highly uncertain. We don't know what is going to happen next. There's a lot of novelty about as well, in the sense that we're seeing some things for the very first time, whether it's technology or whether it's something like politics and geopolitics. It's constantly evolving and it's new. And as a consequence, a lot of these things are difficult to understand. It's difficult to recognize the full meaning and potential of what we're observing. Now, this collection of things, these TUNA conditions, make it very hard for businesses, societies, governments to make decisions and know how to best move forward. It can be quite paralysing. What does that look like for aerospace specifically? I wanted to give a sort of flavour of what TUNA looks like. Well, obviously within aerospace we're seeing some really interesting new technologies such as electric vertical takeoff aircraft or electric regional concepts or even autonomous drone delivery concepts. And obviously we've seen other sectors go through these big disruptive technological changes recently as well, such as the automotive industry and the advent of the electric car. But we've also seen a massive increase in awareness around the climate over the past few years. And aerospace is right at the centre of that in people's views. And so this heightened awareness is driving behaviours. It's starting to really affect change. And of course, the aerospace industry has always been bothered about its contribution to climate change and is constantly pursuing opportunities to further enhance efficiency. But events are now starting to overtake that. And so much so that, of course, last year at the Paris Air Show, we heard from 7 CTOs of some of the biggest aerospace companies in the world stand up to make a commitment to drive faster progress on meeting that sustainability challenge. Can't present a slide like this without mentioning the coronavirus. And this has really shocked the industry, of course, this year in a very dramatic way. And it's uncertain exactly how the future of the industry is going to pan out as a consequence. Coupled with that, we have seen companies like big tech companies such as Amazon benefit off the back of this disruption, able to offer services that meet new needs, and some of these needs may turn out to not be temporary but permanent. And finally, it's worth mentioning the political landscape and the rise of populism and the changing geopolitics around the world, which again is highly disruptive. So what do we do about these TUNA conditions? It can be paralysing, as I mentioned. Well, scenario planning is one way of building our understanding of what these things mean. It's a structured way of thinking about uncertainty. It's not about forecasting and predicting, and the scenarios I'm going to play back in a minute are not our predictions, but they are a set of plausible, relevant, and challenging views of what the future could hold. And having developed those very distinct scenarios, we're able to challenge what we're doing today and consider how that might affect us and what we need to do as businesses and organisations to adapt. We followed the Oxford scenario approach. So this is an outside-in approach where we look at the contextual environment. So these are factors that are beyond our direct control. It's beyond the control of those that we do business with on a daily basis. And this is where we start to build the narratives, the stories that are going to play out. And we then feed these into the transactional environment to understand how they might shape it. The transactional environment, from the perspective of aerospace, will be entities like regulators, governments, airlines, passengers, these sorts of blocks of society and of the ecosystem around us. So that's the approach, and what we did at the ATI was put together a team of ATI experts with some external volunteers to go about doing desk research, but also extensive interviewing. We interviewed around 50 people outside of our organisations, in the aerospace industry, in government, in other industries, environmentalists, oil and gas, a whole spectrum of perspectives. And then we brought that data together to understand what could happen in the future. So the sorts of themes that we developed that research around were as follows. Technology, clearly a major factor in terms of how aerospace has evolved and developed over the years. Demand and social acceptance, how might preferences change into the future? Climate change and the environment, and I'll come back to this point in a moment. But clearly, what might that hold for us in the future? Legal and regulatory, will this be an inhibitor or an enabler of change and progress for the sector? Business and operating models, we've seen some interesting business models evolve over the past, particularly in other industries. What might happen in aerospace? The role of public funding has always been a big part of the aerospace industry development. There's no nation in the world that has a substantial aerospace sector and hasn't supported it with state funding. Geopolitics and demographics, how might that evolve? What new tensions might arise? What new alignments might arise? And how does the changing demographics, makeup of society, affect things? And then finally, talent, skills and capabilities. Where is the sector going to find the people it needs to support it in the future? Where may they be attracted to go in the future? I mentioned climate change, and this is the grand universal challenge that we all face. And this picture I always think is helpful to just give a stark contrast as to where we are today, where we've come from, and the 2050 timeline of our scenarios. And clearly this shows the trajectory we're on has a huge amount of momentum behind it, and therefore the task of turning the corner on accumulation of CO2 and the temperature rise is enormous. And I think this chart sort of justifies why it has become such a big part of our scenarios, as you'll see. And for aerospace within that, well, we know that aerospace contributes around 2.5–3% of CO2 emissions per year, a relatively small portion overall, but that it is extremely hard to abate. And based on at least growth levels that we had last year, was on track by 2050 to become a major contributor were other industries able to decarbonise. And many of those industries will find it easier to decarbonise. So let me take you through the scenarios now. The first one we call Techopoly. So this is a world that was initially driven by consumerism and convenience. It's really all about free markets, letting the entrepreneurs and tech companies go at the opportunities. And so we see the rise of tech giants continue, and we see more and more aerospace startups emerge, presenting new novel solutions which get rapidly adopted. At the same time, we've got aging populations, and this is increasing the burden on the state to support them. This is coupled with a shift of wealth to the virtual world, given that the tech industry is becoming a bigger and bigger part of our lives. And this is making it difficult to recover revenues for states in order to finance the aging population and other societal needs. Then, somewhere halfway through our timeline, there's a series of major climate-related disasters to a level that the international community is unable to respond, and this drives a wholesale retreat into regional solitude for survival. The tech industry that has developed some of those highly novel solutions earlier on in the period, driven by the markets, is now able to pivot and, in a sense, come to the rescue, enable us to adapt and survive and meet our needs in a different way. During the period, we can see Europe and China engaging in a bigger R&D race within aerospace around new types of energy and propulsion. In 2050, you could summarise the skies as being full of new local movement, such as drones and eVTOL type aircraft, but not so much in terms of long distance traditional air travel. But they are safe as well. So that's Techopoly. The next scenario we developed is what we call Eco-It Alone. This is a society that has become very carbon conscious. It's disenchanted with the lack of intergovernmental cooperation and action. And whilst there are big statements around what we're going to go and do and what we're going to go and invest in, it's the competition behind the scenes between nations that is blocking the progress and the deployment of those resources. We also see increased hostilities between nations in terms of trade sanctions and populism, and this is giving a rise to a defence need in order to secure access to critical resources. There is a reverse in globalisation and a decline in air travel. The aerospace sector is forced to pivot its capabilities towards energy, defence and other forms of mobility. Nation states are striving for energy self-sufficiency. So they're all deploying different forms of technology given their own individual circumstances to do that. There's a boom in artificial reality and virtual reality and a revolution in ground transportation. Sustainability replaces GDP as a measurement of societal success. So in 2050 the skies are cleaner, but they're also empty. This scenario has the biggest effect on projected CO2 accumulation. Our final scenario is called Good Intentions. This is where continued prioritization of GDP growth is behind how we work and the decisions we make. This reduces inequality and grows the middle class, further spurring on GDP growth. There is a global coordinated response to the climate change challenge, but behind the scenes, that bureaucracy, that competition is standing in the way of deploying funds. Growth starts to outstrip climate progress. Society feels reassured by leaders that a climate solution is coming. And so it's patient, it waits, and carries on consuming. But delays in that technological process and some emissions reporting scandals or something of that nature then start to erode confidence. Progress on climate change is at least 10 to 15 years behind the plan we were promised, but the breakthroughs are eventually starting to materialise. In this case, in 2050, the skies are busy, but they're full of historically accumulated greenhouse gases. So in this case, actually the accumulation of CO2 is the highest of all of our scenarios, because we've continued to grow and expand whilst being led to believe that we had a plan. So those are our three scenarios, and we've published a paper on this. It's a light read, give you a flavour of the different scenarios, and included within that paper are logic maps that explain how we develop those narratives and why those narratives might make sense. It's worth taking a look at the key assumptions across the different scenarios. It gives you a sense of the contrast that exists between them. So here you can see the three scenarios on the screen. The white box that comes up will remain effectively what is today's assumption. So in terms of travel, air travel, good intentions is the one that continues to adopt our view, of today. So widespread demand for air travel continues. Under EcoIt alone, it's climate policy and societal priorities that diminish all air travel. It's too great a polluter. And then in Techopoly, conflicts diminish international air travel over time as nations retreat and adapt following climate events. But regional travel has expanded, exploded really, in terms of the use of the skies, using that disruptive technology such as eVTOLs and drone delivery type services. It's a different set of players that are dominating the skies there. In terms of what the aircraft market itself looks like, well, the only one that actually looks like it does today in terms of aircraft families and segmentation is EcoIt alone. Nothing changes fundamentally in that scenario. There's little point in innovation. But in good intentions, actually we start to see disruption in various market segments, from short haul to new classes of aircraft designed to optimize particular missions and deliver on those sustainability challenges. And in Techopoly, as I've said, the aircraft market is completely disrupted by the advent of electrification and really the expansion of more local regional uses of the airspace. In terms of competition within transport, well, within good intentions, no significant competing competitions, modes of competition emerge really. But in EcoIt alone, it's all about using green land-based mobility solutions, high-speed rail, autonomous vehicles, electrically powered. And in Techopoly, well, it's about drones and hopping models of transport that really dominate the skies. And in terms of the skills that I mentioned earlier, well, in Techopoly, it's kind of as it is today. Aerospace remains attractive. In fact, it's really exciting. There's some amazing new innovations that are being worked on. In EcoIt alone, it's completely the opposite. It's not attractive, and it's effectively a last man, last person standing scenario. And then in good intentions, well, it's controversial. To some, it's highly attractive. To others, it's not. So that gives you a sense of the sort of key assumptions we make today and how they vary across the scenarios. Now, I can't talk about the scenarios, of course, without coming back to COVID-19 and the impact that's having. What we have seen in the last 6 months is incredible. Flying all but halted, bankruptcies, order cancellations, MRO activity slashed. But the question in terms of the scenario outlook of this piece of work, which is much longer term, is what could the sustained effect be from all of this once the virus has passed? Well, there's a couple of views you could take on that. You could look at society's view. Do we need or want to travel as much as a consequence of forced changes in behaviour and forced changes in expectations? Can we afford to travel as much, either for the sake of our purse or the environment? And so there's a number of big societal uncertainties Is it going to become a world about spending or saving, moving or staying, traveling more, traveling less? And how are our habits and behaviours fundamentally going to change and stick? Big unknowns. In terms of the impact on the business perspective, well, how does this affect the way we need to operate? Already businesses are discovering actual benefits from the effect of a lockdown in terms of how they operate. Productivity from actually working remotely, whereas in the past it's been difficult to adopt those sorts of policies. What is the long-term market impact? Which markets are now expanding and are look to stay prosperous versus which are in decline? And what new opportunities does this create, particularly for the disruptors, the entrepreneurs out there? Events like this can precipitate new players, new major players onto the scene. So business uncertainties, there's a whole host. Do you rationalise what you do as a business? Do you diversify? Do you continue to globalize or consolidate? Do you invest or do you attempt to disrupt? A whole host of different things could happen. And then finally, in terms of the impact on the state view, how does this affect state finances? We've seen enormous levels of public support, financial support deployed, which is going to take decades to resolve. And how is that going to be resolved? What does this mean for international cohesion and understanding of what sovereign capability is? Given the need to suddenly acquire assets we didn't really anticipate needing to acquire to service the health system in this event. And how does this change political priorities as well? So a whole number of national uncertainties. Do you increase market control? Do you loosen it? What is your fiscal attitude? Is it austerity or is it about investment or taxation? What are your political priorities and what are your political behaviours? How do those evolve? And new tensions that this has brought up, will they stick or will they eventually melt away? Now, our view is that it is very likely this pandemic will have a sustained impact on the drivers within our scenarios, those fundamental drivers, and a notable long-term shift in our future path. But again, we're not sure exactly what, and we have looked at the different drivers, the pathways I popped up on the screen earlier, and you can start to anticipate how the impact of COVID-19 could play out on some of those and slightly affect our long-term trajectory. But I'm not going to offer a view on that in this presentation. That I'm going to leave to the reader, and I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to download our paper and give these questions on the page some consideration. So to wrap up this presentation, we did develop a number of recommendations looking across our scenarios, thinking about, well, what do these mean and what can we do about them? And a few things came out as fairly universally clear actions we could be taking. The first is to set an ambitious zero carbon technology agenda with much more pace behind it, with some more stretching targets and goals, and accept that not all of those ambitions are going to work, but we need to do everything we can to deliver a more sustainable industry. Second, drive action and impact on a global and local level. What do I mean by that? Global cohesion is going to be really important to solve our problems. We can't do this by siloing the world. We can solve the problem together. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we are demonstrating our impact and our benefit as an industry at a local level, particularly where significant public funds are being deployed to support the sector. And we need, this is about developing all-round stakeholder support for driving action. And then finally, looking beyond the boundaries, the traditional boundaries of the sector for innovation, seeking out disruption before we are disrupted. And there are some amazing innovations and ideas outside the sector that the ATI has been involved in bringing into aerospace. But I'm confident that the things we've done so far are only the tip of the iceberg. We need to go much further, and companies need to engage in this as well. There are very different ways of working and delivering that can speed up the process and that can challenge our preconceptions on what is possible and how things are done. We need to embrace that. So I want to thank you for your attention and listening to the ATI Scenarios presentation. Again, encouraging you to go to the ATI website and download our paper. Thank you very much for your attention.